This video focuses on Richard Neustadt and his instrumental book from 1960 called Presidential Power, in which he argued that the way that presidents can succeed is in essence only through their powers of persuasion. And we're going to focus in on how he's different than some other presidential scholars and their discussion of success. So in the context of this being the second of three different videos on presidential success, we saw that the first one was based on presidential personality and the development of an individual from childhood through adolescence, had a profound effect on the way that a president would behave while president, and that was James David Barber, his book Presidential Character. Today we're going to study Neustadt, who essentially believes that individuals have the ability to be able to exercise power if they know how to persuade. And then finally, the third in our series here will be Stephen Skowronek's The Politics Presidents Make, which focuses on the historical circumstances in which a president finds him or herself in will be the profound difference in them being able to succeed. So when we take a look at Neustadt's political power, it was really designed, some people say, kind of like Machiavelli's The Prince, as a handbook for a way that a president could succeed in what was called the modern presidency. And in looking at that, Neustadt made a very clear delineation or break between what he called the pre-modern and the modern presidency. So the modern presidency began essentially with Franklin Roosevelt as he came to power in 1933 after winning the election in 1932. Before that, what was expected of a president was not nearly as much as it became after we saw President Roosevelt being elected. And that might either mean that the president did very little in relationships to Congress. And of course, the presidential powers developed quite a bit from Lincoln on. But what he saw was that in post Great Depression America, beginning with Roosevelt, going into Truman, Eisenhower, and he was right around Kennedy, that every president was in essentially at the same crisis footing as they had been before. So we had the Great Depression that Franklin Roosevelt had to deal with. We had World War II that Roosevelt dealt with. Then we came into Truman's presidency, in which he still had World War II, and then Korea and the Cold War. And in addition to that, civil rights in the United States. And then we got into the Eisenhower president, again with civil rights. I'm sorry, we misjudged that back there on the Korean War started, during Truman's presidency, but kind of finished up during Eisenhower's presidency. And then again, a prolongation of the Cold War, and also the belief that the president should have a large effect on the economy. So Neustadt says, hey, we need to write a new book on how these modern presidents should actually affect politics and how they can be successful, because we have an enormous amount of things that we expect of the president in this modern presidency. How can you succeed? And he says, go back to Article 2 of the Constitution and look through all the powers that the president has in Article 2 of the Constitution, and you'll see that there aren't really enough powers there to be able to give the president enough ability to be able to wield power over not only the executive branch, but also the rest of the federal government and the other branches, and also to deal with international crisis at the same time. So he says that those formal powers are not enough. They're not adequate. The only thing that you really have is the power to persuade. So let's explore that a bit in relationship to a couple of other concepts that he talks about. He really gives us a couple of ways that presidents could be successful in getting what they wanted. One, as I just mentioned, was the use of formal constitutional powers. And again, as we just talked about, those are inadequate. If you take a look at all the presidential powers, doesn't have the power to be commander-in-chief, but again, who holds the purse strings, who has the ability to be able to declare war? That's Congress. The president does have the power to be able to intervene in legislation through the power of veto, but that could be overridden. not to mention the fact that you're dealing with a Congress that might be of a different political party and a divided government. So those really aren't adequate for the most part to be able to succeed as president. The second thing that he discusses is, there's some belief that all you need is a president who can make a logical argument to people in Congress, and those people will hear that logical argument and at that point in time say, oh, that's a great idea. Why don't we enact that into policy? But the reality of the world is very different, right? So good arguments don't always win. Compromise is what's necessary, particularly when you've got a bicameral Congress, particularly when you've got the checks and balances system that we have. And also, not to mention that even within different political parties, the areas that you represent may have different interests than somebody else. So if I'm the president, the logic of my argument of what's good for the country may not be necessarily what's good for individual senators and their states or individual districts and the members of the House of Representatives. So logic does not always win. Politics is not a game of zeros and ones where we can cut it down to an equation. It's really about compromise, log rolling, and being able to find something that's sensible to everybody. A third method of success Neustadt looks at is the idea of command. And this does work sometimes. There's a picture down here in your right-hand corner of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And if you're familiar with the cases that happened there, obviously the Brown versus Board of Education, the two decisions related to that case were 1954 and 55, and said that schools had to be segregated. Little Rock was one of those areas in Arkansas that had segregated schools. And in the fall of 1957 and early September, school went back to session, and Governor Orville Falbus of Arkansas called out the National Guard in an effort to be able to prevent the integration of the schools. And in so doing, he basically said that he was calling out the National Guard to preserve the peace, because if what came to be known as the Little Rock Nine, if those African-American students had been able to go to the school, there would be violence. So his idea was that you keep the African-American students out and there wouldn't be violence. It was obviously a pro-segregation stance. So in this situation, there was very little that President Eisenhower could do to persuade him not to do that. Eisenhower himself was somewhat agnostic on the cause of civil rights. He believed in civil rights, but wasn't sure that the idea of moving really quickly was a good idea. But he was not willing to have the governor of Arkansas reject a Supreme Court decision, given the enormity of that precedent. So he called up the National Guard from Arkansas, disbanded them, and sent in, as I recall, it was the 101st Airborne of the Army to make sure that the students could get into the school, the Little Rock Nine, which you see going up the steps of Central. Now, the problem is that is something, because the president is the commander-in-chief, that is one of those clear instances in which the president does have a constitutional power to be able to command something to be done. But in general, the ability to be able to do that is few and far between. So at the end of the day, then, really the only tool that the president has is this tool of persuasion. So let's take a little bit a deeper look at what he means by the tool of persuasion. As he defines that in Presidential Power, he says, persuasion is the ability to convince other leaders that what the White House wants of them is what they ought to do for their own sake and on their own authority. And just to round that out a little bit more, and we'll come back and clean that up, Neustadt claims that the persuasion deals in the coin of self-interest with men who have some freedom to reject what they find counterfeit. Think about that for a second. Persuasion deals in the coin of self-interest with men who have some freedom to reject what they find counterfeit. What we're looking at here is the idea of different interests, and the fact that when we take a look at checks and balances, particularly the balances, as an individual member of Congress, as an individual who might be in an administration, I have my own self-interest, which may clash with the view of what the president wants. I can reject the president in a system of separation of powers. So what the president has to do then, and the way that the president uses persuasion, is by essentially saying, hey, this is the idea that I've come up with to solve this problem. And I think it's a good idea because it will help you get reelected, or it will help your constituents, or it would help you further your career. My ability to be able to persuade has to be in some manner a way that makes a person think about their own self-interest and think about their self-interest being served if I follow what the president says. Because I can command them. I can't just rely on logic. I have to rely on somebody else's self-interest and make my case in light of their self-interest. Now, there are a couple of tools that Neustadt says increase the powers of the president to be able to persuade. I've also thrown up a fourth one here by a more recent scholar, Samuel Cornell. One is the idea of reputation for power. Some politicians or some presidents are better known at being skilled at the political game than are others. There are some presidents that focus more on kind of the logical argument and not wanting to play the game of politics. But those who are known to be able to exercise power tend to be more persuasive. Public prestige is important, and that means more than just popularity. So in many respects, if a president may be of a different political party but has high approval ratings, people give them the benefit of the doubt because they don't want to run counter to the president's power and risk making the president mad. In addition to that, you oftentimes see the public prestige of a president decline, particularly at the end of their term when they're quote unquote lame ducks, and Congress doesn't feel the need really to fall in line behind them. And then the final tool that Neustadt talks about is the idea of party leadership. There are oftentimes different wings of a political party, and it's the president who needs to hold those wings together and make satisfactory agreements between everybody to hold the party together in order to be able to succeed, and persuade the different sides of the party that what's good for him is also good for the party as a whole in their future going forward. Then finally, Samuel Cornell talks about, quote unquote, going public, and that is that the president can succeed when he delivers the message through the media in an effort to be able to go over the heads of Congress directly to the constituents, make the case to them, and then have the constituents provide some sort of pressure back on members of Congress to be able to force them to vote for the way the president wants. There is some contrary scholarship by George Edwards that says that doesn't actually work, but nonetheless is a tool that presidents believe does work and they intend to be able to do. So that's just a very quick general overview of Richard Neustadt and the idea of the power to persuade.